Midnight Resistance is a side-scrolling run-and-gun game produced by Data East and released in arcades in 1989. Midnight Resistance is set in a dystopian future where the player controls a member of a resistance movement who goes on a mission to rescue his kidnapped family from an entity known as King Crimson. Midnight Resistance uses play mechanics and controls similar to that of the Contra series, and can be played by up to 2 players simultaneously. The main distinguishing feature is the inclusion of a rotatable joystick similar to the one used in Ikari Warriors, allowing the player to adjust his character's aim in one of 8 directions by rotating the joystick clockwise or counterclockwise. This allows the player to keep their aim in one direction while moving in another, even while crawling or jumping.
Nitro. Freeway.
The power-up system has the player collecting keys after defeating certain enemy soldiers. Each player can possess up to 6 keys at a time. At the end of each stage, the player will enter a weapon storage room in which various new weapons and other power-ups can be released from their lockers, depending on the number of keys in the player's possession. When the player loses a life, he will drop all the weapons and keys he has in his possession, and they can only be recovered if they do not fall off screen. When you first look at Midnight Resistance, it looks a fairly uninspiring game, to be honest, and just looks like a bog standard run and gun. And when you play it for the first time, you think to yourself, what a really weird set of controls. Why have they done this? But after a few minutes of playing, and once you get used to the controls, you then think to yourself, these controls are excellent. What a difference it makes to the gameplay. Midnight Resistance is one of those games that does prove you can't judge a book by its cover. And when you play it, you realise that Data East have actually made one of the greatest arcade games ever. Let's go back to the controls. These rotational sticks allow for more control, but Data East have used them to perfection here, and the range of aim by the player means enemies will come from all of those directions, and this is where part of the challenge comes from. In previous run and gun games, you could shoot in the direction you are facing, and diagonally up or down, so that's 3 angles of shot. In Midnight Resistance, you have 8 directions of shot, and all while moving at the same time. To make sure the player gets adjusted to the control system, the early levels do not really utilise the need for the rotational joystick, but by the time you get to the later levels, it comes into its own. This level, where you run forwards but shoot backwards for the whole level, is the level that catches the player's eyes. Apart from the fact the visuals are absolutely gorgeous, it just looks so different from anything else around at the time. Speaking of the visuals, all throughout the game they are impressive. This really has to be one of the best looking games Data East have ever produced, especially when compared to the terrible graphics seen in Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja. The detail might be low, but the use of bright colours and the animation for every sprite looks glorious and a real feast for the eyes. There are some neat touches on the main sprite, like when you fire your gun, you can see the recoil on the gun and the sprite's arm moves for each shot. I have always maintained that graphics don't make a game good, but a good game with good graphics enhances the playing experience. The sound is excellent in this game as well. I've always liked the music in this game. The tunes are very catchy and help add to the atmosphere of each level in the game. The sound effects are great as well, with satisfying explosions and gunshots letting rip all over the place.
Homing missile, 3-way!
This is a game I absolutely loved in the arcade, but due to the complex controls, it was going to be impossible for home ports to even come close to this. Even on emulation it's tough. I configured this to use the same control style as the one used in the Megadrive version, where one button rotates left and another one to the right. And even then, it's still not as intuitive as the arcades. But it works, and after a few goes, it works reasonably well. The home ports of this game were a mixed bag. Some were good and some were bad, but in my opinion, the best home port of this was the one in the Megadrive. Megadrive game had lost quite a few things in translation. The controls being one obvious thing, but the lack of a second player was another. Now, before I continue, I have to say this. When Final Fight was released on the SNES, Megadrive owners were quick to point out that it's only a single player game. Oh, and this has made it a bad game. Nobody said nout about this for Midnight Resistance on the Megadrive. High school kids of the 1990s showing Scottish football referee levels of consistency right there. Anyway, Data East had done a great job here on this port. They gave the player the option of a few different control methods, but the best one for me was the one where you fire automatically and use the A and C buttons to rotate left or right and B to jump. It worked very well indeed. To compensate for the difference in the controls, the enemy waves are slightly different from the arcade version and there are less of them as well. The visuals took a slight hit in the Megadrive port. As per usual, the detail was reduced from the arcade version and everything looked a tiny bit smaller. But the gameplay came damn close to the arcade, even if the challenge level was not quite the same. And even without the 2-player mode, it's still good. Midnight Resistance did not need to be played as a 2-player to make it a great game. It was a great game, full stop. The sound was missing some speech, and the tunes were a little bit tinnier as well. But again, this makes no difference to the gameplay, and the tunes were still catchy, even if they didn't sound as good as their arcade counterparts. A mate of mine hired this for a few days during the school summer holidays, and we played it non-stop pretty much. The gameplay was very addictive and was every bit as good as the arcade, and Data East done an amazing job of porting the arcade across to Sega's 16-bit Wonder Machine. This was a game that was quite expensive on import. Most places were charging 50 quid at the time. This was a staggeringly expensive Megadrive game, but it seemed to take ages to come out officially, and by the time it did get released in Europe, I had already stopped buying games for the Megadrive and had shifted focus to the Super Nintendo. And this is why it was a game I never owned, but was always one I wished I had in my collection. In my opinion, Midnight Resistance was one of the greatest arcade games ever made, and possibly Data East's best game they ever made, and is a true arcade giant that everyone should have a go of. And that's my look back at Midnight Resistance. Do you agree with my opinions on this game? Please feel free to comment below, and please give a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. That's all from me, folks. Thanks for watching.